I'd been out of work for months when I got the call. The voice on the other end was cold and flat, like it was reading off a script. "You're hired. You'll be working the night shift at the amusement park. Report to the main gate at 8 p.m. I didn't care that it was an abandoned park. Hell, it was the only offer I had. When they told me how much they'd pay, my stomach twisted. It was too much for a janitor's job, especially in a place that hadn't seen visitors in years. But the money was good, and I needed it. By the time I got there, the sun had long dipped below the horizon. The park loomed ahead, a grotesque silhouette against the dull glow of the moon. The rusting skeletons of roller coasters clawed at the sky. The carousel, with its chipped paint and weathered horses, sat eerily still. It was as if time had frozen here, but it wasn't the kind of stillness that was comforting. It was wrong, like the air itself was holding its breath. I parked my car near the entrance, the gravel crunching beneath my tires, and took a deep breath. The smell of stale air and rotting wood wafted out, seeping into my lungs. I couldn't tell if it was the decaying park or something else, but there was an unmistakable heaviness to the air, like the place was suffocating. A figure appeared in the dim light, stepping out of the shadows. He was tall, dressed in a long coat that seemed too formal for someone working at a rundown amusement park. His face was pale, with sharp features that looked like they hadn't seen the sun in years. The man didn't smile. He didn't even blink. Just stood there watching me with piercing eyes that made me feel like I was being examined, as if I wasn't a person anymore. Just a specimen. "Hazel, right?" His voice was a monotone, so flat it was hard to tell if he was even speaking to me or to himself. I nodded, unsure of what else to do. "Mr. Rook," he said, as if that explained everything. "Follow me." He led me to a small, rusted door at the back of the park. The light above it flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. The air inside was colder than outside, and I shivered as I stepped in. The faint smell of mildew and something metallic hung in the air. "Take a seat," Mr. Rook instructed, motioning to a wooden chair in front of a dusty desk. I sat, the wood creaking beneath me. The desk was cluttered with old paperwork, stacks of forgotten memories, but on top of it was a thick, yellowed manual. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. He slid it across the desk to me without saying a word. I hesitated before picking it up. The cover was stained, the pages brittle to the touch. When I flipped it open, the first thing I saw was a long list of rules. My eyes skimmed them, but the further I read, the worse the words seemed. The rules were bizarre, unsettling. Rule 1. Do not look at the animatronics, especially their eyes. My stomach tightened. The animatronics? I glanced at the faint outline of something beyond the window. In the distance, I could just make out the carousel, the shapes of horses with twisted, broken bodies. Rule 2. Never clean the toy storage room after midnight. The idea of cleaning up in a room full of toys, dolls, stuffed animals, whatever, felt wrong already. But why after midnight? Why the specific warning? Rule 3. Do not step into the house of mirrors. Not ever. Even if it looks like someone is inside. My brow furrowed. What kind of rule was that? It sounded like something out of a child's nightmare. Rule 4. If the music stops, leave immediately, no exceptions. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The kind of music a park like this would play was probably something out of a dream, or worse, a nightmare. I looked up from the manual and saw that Mr. Rook's eyes were fixed on me. Piercing, unblinking. "The park is alive," he said softly, his voice carrying an edge of something ancient, something dangerous. "It's been here for a long time. Don't wake it up. Don't disturb its rest." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling deep in my gut. He stood, and I quickly followed suit. Mr. Rook walked to the door, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the silence of the place. "Your shift starts now," he said, turning back to look at me once more. His face was cold, expressionless. "Remember the rules. If you don't, it's not just your job you'll lose." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone in the darkened room. I stared at the thick manual in my hands, the words blurring together as my mind raced. The unease I felt before began to turn into something more, something that gripped my insides and wouldn't let go. I took a deep breath and tried to shake it off. It was just a job, right? Just a stupid set of rules. But the more I thought about them, the more I realized. Those rules weren't there to protect me. They were there to protect the park. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air in the park seemed thicker tonight, weighed down by an oppressive silence. The only sounds were the faint hum of electricity running through the rides and the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. The flickering lights above me cast long, jagged shadows on the cracked pavement as I made my way down the empty path. I tried to focus on the task at hand, cleaning the restrooms and keeping the park tidy for whatever reason, but I couldn't ignore the sense that I was being watched. Every step I took felt like I was walking deeper into something I couldn't escape, something that didn't want me here. As I scrubbed the filthy floors of the men's restroom, the hum of the lights above buzzed like an insect trapped inside a jar. But it wasn't just the lights that hummed. There was an odd vibration in the air, a low-frequency sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I'd hear faint, shifting noises behind me, like footsteps or whispers, but every time I turned around, no one was there. The further I moved into the park, the worse it got. The empty pathways, once so familiar in their solitude, felt like the very ground was alive, as if the park was breathing. Every time I glanced up, I could have sworn the shadows were shifting. I tried to brush it off. It's just nerves, I thought. It's just the isolation getting to me. But then the first rule of Mr. Rook's strange manual hit me. I wasn't supposed to look at the animatronics. I hadn't even seen any yet, not up close. I hadn't gone past the gates of the carousel. But I knew they were out there, standing in the distance, watching, and against my better judgment, I glanced over. At first I saw nothing unusual, but then, there, a figure in the dim light. It was the clown, a twisted, grotesque figure with a cracked, chipped face painted in two bright colors. Its frizzy, synthetic hair was matted, and the huge, exaggerated grin stretched unnaturally across its face. It looked like a relic, a nightmare made flesh. I couldn't stop staring. Its eyes, those cold, glassy eyes, seemed to move. I didn't dare look away, but I could feel it. It was looking at me, watching, waiting. I snapped my gaze back to the ground, trying to force the image out of my head, but the feeling didn't fade. The eyes were still on me, even though I refused to look back. My heart pounded in my chest. I had broken the first rule. I'd let the park's silent presence invade my thoughts. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but every nerve in my body was on edge. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I tried to continue my work, but nothing felt normal. Every step, every sound seemed magnified. The park was closing in on me. I forced myself to keep moving, heading toward the carousel. The ride was dark, abandoned, yet the gears inside seemed to be turning on their own. The sound of clicking metal echoed through the night air, and I froze in my tracks, staring at the horses. At first, I thought it was just the wind pushing the ride, but no, the horses were moving. Their bodies twitched, jerking slightly in place, as if some invisible hand was guiding them. The delicate framework of one horse's leg flexed, and the other's eyes, those hollow, lifeless eyes, shifted in my direction. The carousel hadn't turned on. The ride hadn't begun. But something in those horses, in the way they seemed to stretch toward me with unnatural mechanical precision, made my stomach churn. I took a step back, trying to shake it off, but my feet felt heavy. The air seemed thicker, colder. I couldn't stop myself. My curiosity got the better of me. I had to see more. The toy storage room. The words from the manual echoed in my mind. Never clean the toy storage room after midnight. But it was already past midnight, and I couldn't ignore the pull. The feeling that something waited in there for me. I walked to the back of the park, the path lined with dead plants and rusting fences. The door to the storage room was ajar, just slightly, enough to entice me inside. The air that leaked out from the cracks smelled faintly of dust and something else, something that reminded me of old, forgotten things. I stepped in. Inside, the room was dark, save for a faint glow coming from an overhead light that flickered erratically. Rows upon rows of dolls and stuffed animals were neatly stacked against the walls. Their glassy eyes stared out at me, unblinking. The stillness in the room was suffocating. The dolls stood in rows, their pale, porcelain faces frozen in wide-eyed, innocent expressions, but something about them, something about the way they watched me, made my skin crawl. I hesitated at the entrance, suddenly aware of how alone I was in this room. I could hear my own breathing and the soft sound of my footsteps on the dusty floor. But then, it happened. One of the dolls, near the back of the room, moved. Its head turned toward me, just a fraction, but enough for me to notice. My heart leapt into my throat. I blinked. It wasn't possible. The doll hadn't moved, it couldn't have. But when I blinked again, the doll's eyes were still locked on me. It hadn't been my imagination. I backed up quickly, my mind racing, but as I turned to flee, I felt something cold, something thin and bony, grab my leg. A tug, sharp and sudden, like fingers wrapped around my ankle. I looked down. There was nothing there. My breath caught in my throat. The fingers were gone, but the sensation lingered. Cold, wet, and gone. I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind me, my heart hammering in my chest. I stumbled back toward the break room, the cold air biting at my skin as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. It was nothing, just nerves, I told myself. You're imagining things. But when I entered the break room, something was wrong. Mr. Rook was waiting for me. He was standing by the door, his eyes fixed on me with that same unnerving calm. "You went into the toy storage," he said quietly. I nodded, my throat dry. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. There was a heavy silence between us, the kind that made the walls feel like they were closing in. "I told you not to," Mr. Rook added, his voice colder now. "You have to leave the toys alone. After midnight, they're not just toys anymore." Before I could ask what he meant, I heard it. The carousel. The music. It had stopped. Then the music started again, but this time it was different. It was wrong. A discordant, distorted tune like a broken music box grinding to life. I didn't wait. I didn't think. I grabbed my coat and bolted for the door. The sound of the carousel played louder and louder in my ears, growing until it was all I could hear as I locked the door behind me and ran. I felt dizzy, like I was losing my mind. This isn't real. I didn't sleep much after the first night. The more I thought about what happened, the less real it seemed. I kept telling myself it was just the stress, the isolation. Maybe I was just imagining things. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. Something was wrong, and I was stuck here, alone in the park, night after night. When I showed up for my second shift, the air felt heavier, like it was suffocating me. The same unsettling silence filled the park, but this time I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that I wasn't alone. I walked through the main gate, the flickering lights above casting long shadows, making the place look like something out of a nightmare. Mr. Rook's words from the night before echoed in my mind. "The park is alive. Don't wake it up." But I wasn't sure if it was alive, or if I was just losing my mind. I couldn't avoid the rules. No matter how much I tried to convince myself, they were just old superstition. Tonight, I was assigned the funhouse. The House of Mirrors. The thought of it sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't dared to get close to it since the first time I walked through the park, but tonight, it was unavoidable. I grabbed my cleaning supplies and trudged toward the decrepit building. The door creaked open on its own, and the moment I stepped inside, the temperature dropped. It was freezing in there, the cold clinging to my skin like a heavy blanket. The mirrors that lined the walls seemed to reflect everything in warped, grotesque versions of themselves. My own face, distorted and stretched, stared back at me with a mocking grin. The walls seemed to close in with each step I took. The further I moved into the dark corridors, the stranger the reflections became. My image flickered, sometimes bending unnaturally, sometimes completely disappearing. I felt a twinge of panic rise in my chest, but I forced it down. I couldn't be scared of reflections, could I? I had to focus. I needed the money. But then I heard it. The sound of footsteps. Not my own. Someone was following me. The sound echoed in the narrow halls, making the mirrors vibrate. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was no one behind me. Only my reflection, staring back with wide eyes. I kept walking, my breathing shallow. The footsteps continued, always just behind me, and every time I turned to look, no one was there, but I could feel it. A presence. Something watching. And then I saw it. A figure, standing in one of the mirrors. It was thin, twisted, and faceless. At first I thought it was just another distorted reflection of mine, but the more I stared, the more I realized it wasn't me at all. The figure was wrong. Its body was bent at odd angles, its limbs stretched and contorted. The reflection seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. I took a step back, my pulse racing. But the figure, it moved. It stepped out of the mirror. I froze. My legs felt like lead, and I could hardly breathe. The figure's body was so thin, so unnatural, it seemed to melt out of the glass. The way it moved, it wasn't human. It glided toward me in a smooth, unnatural motion, its faceless head tilted to the side as if examining me. I could feel its gaze, even though it had no eyes. I stumbled backward, my hands scrambling for the door, but I couldn't seem to find it. The mirrors around me shifted, twisting, blocking the way I came. I was trapped. I pushed my hands against the walls, desperate to find a way out, but the mirrors seemed to bend and twist with every movement, changing shape like they were alive. The walls closed in on me, pulling me deeper into the maze. The air grew colder with each passing second, and the whispers began. They started as a low hum, almost inaudible, but then they grew louder. The walls themselves seemed to be alive, murmuring my name over and over, a chant that echoed in the dark corners of the house. Hazel, Hazel, Hazel. My heart raced as the words burrowed into my brain. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The sound of my name, spoken by 1,000 unseen voices, rattled my mind. I turned, but there was no way out. The mirrors had closed around me, trapping me in their endless reflections. And then I saw it. A mannequin. It stood in the far corner, just like one of the countless others I'd seen in the funhouse. But there was something wrong about this one. Its body was slightly hunched, and its face, distorted into a twisted grin, was wrong. The eyes didn't look like they were made of glass. They were alive. It took a step forward, then another. I backed away, my hands trembling as I reached for anything to protect myself, but there was nothing. The mannequin's feet scraped against the floor, moving with deliberate slowness, but the smile on its face stretched wider and wider with each step. The whispers grew louder. Hazel, Hazel, Hazel. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and bolted, running as fast as I could through the maze of mirrors. I couldn't tell where I was anymore. The reflections were a blur of shapes and faces, twisting and shifting in a dance that made me dizzy. I could hear the mannequin's footsteps growing louder, closer. My heart was in my throat as I screamed, desperate for an exit. Finally, I spotted a door. I didn't care if it led to nowhere. I just needed to escape. I shoved it open and stumbled into the cold night air. The park felt strangely quiet after the madness of the funhouse. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, my body trembling with adrenaline. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out. I didn't wait. I ran straight to the break room, hands shaking as I locked the door behind me. Mr. Rook was waiting for me. His face was as cold as usual, his eyes scanning me like a piece of furniture he was deciding whether or not to keep. "You went near the House of Mirrors," he said, his voice clipped. I nodded, too shaken to speak. "You never go near it after dark," he warned. His tone wasn't harsh, but there was something darker beneath it. "It has its own way of inviting people in. Once it gets its hooks into you, it won't let you go." I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to know what he meant. All I wanted was to forget the things I'd seen inside. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. The park had already sunk its claws into me. It's getting harder to ignore the pull of the toy storage room, like a constant hum, but the curiosity gnawing at me is worse. I know I shouldn't go back, that the dolls are dangerous, that whatever waits for me inside that room is not just a collection of forgotten toys, but I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't let it go. Tonight I told myself I'd stick to my duties, no more wandering. But the more I worked, the more I found myself thinking about the toy storage. There was something about it that I couldn't shake, something in the back of my mind that urged me to go back. I tried to push the thoughts away, but by midnight, the temptation was too much. The break room was empty, the air still and stale as I sat alone, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on me. "It's just once," I told myself. "Just once, and I'll know if it's real." My heart raced as I stood up, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. I grabbed my flashlight and headed straight for the back of the park, the same path I had taken the night before. The air seemed colder now, and the darkness wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. Every step I took felt heavier, like the ground itself was pulling me down, warning me not to go any further. When I reached the door to the toy storage room, my hand trembled as I pushed it open. The familiar smell of dust and decay filled the air, but there was something new, something thick and metallic, like rust or blood. I crept inside, my footsteps muffled by the layers of grime on the floor. The overhead light flickered erratically, casting long shadows across the rows of dolls and stuffed animals stacked in neat piles. Their glassy eyes followed me as I moved deeper into the room, their empty faces fixed in that eerie, lifeless gaze. But this time, they were different. I froze. The dolls, they were moving. Not like before. This wasn't the flicker of imagination or a trick of the light. The porcelain bodies twitched, and I saw the faintest flicker of movement. One of them blinked, its glass eyes snapping shut, then opening again, focused directly on me. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step back, but before I could react, another doll moved, this one's mouth opening in a silent scream. There was no sound, just the horrible, twisted movement of its lips, as if begging for release, for help that would never come. I felt my heart pound in my chest, the urge to flee rising with every inch closer I took. But something inside me pushed me forward, an unrelenting need to understand. I stepped closer, and that's when it happened. A doll, this one dressed in a tattered sailor suit, lunged at me, its porcelain fingers gripping my wrist with unnatural strength. Its face twisted into a grin that seemed to grow wider with every passing second. I yanked my arm back, but its grip was vice-like, pulling me deeper into the room. The shadows around the back of the room seemed thicker now, darker, like they were swallowing the light whole. I could see nothing but blackness where the dolls had once been stacked neatly. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the very walls were pressing in on me. And then, like a flood, they came. The dolls. They swarmed me, crawling from their shelves with jerky, unnatural movements. Their fingers, thin and fragile as they looked, were impossibly strong. I felt them clutching at my legs, my arms, my neck. Their cold fingers scraped at my skin, and I gasped, trying to shake them off, but they kept coming, pulling me toward the back of the room, where the shadows were alive, moving, twisting like a living thing. I couldn't breathe. I was drowning in their cold, clammy touch. And then the walls themselves began to bleed. Black tar-like liquid oozed from the cracks between the wooden panels. It dripped down, slow at first, but then faster, pooling on the floor around my feet. It was thick, slick, and as it spread, the dolls moved even faster, their jerky motions becoming more frantic. Their mouths opened wider, but still no sound. Just that terrible, silent scream. The smell hit me next, a rancid, fetid stench, like something rotting in the dark. My skin crawled as I felt the cold liquid coat my shoes, my legs, rising up around my knees, slick and suffocating. I had to get out. I fought against the dolls, desperate, my hands trembling as I grabbed for anything I could use to push them away. My fingers found the edge of a shelf, and I shoved it aside, knocking over a pile of dolls. It was enough to break free, but only for a moment. The dolls reached for me, their hands like claws, pulling at my clothes, tugging at my hair. I turned and ran. My heart hammered in my chest as I scrambled toward the door. The tar on the floor stuck to my feet, pulling me back with every step. I yanked the door open and bolted out into the hall, my legs trembling with exhaustion. The doll's hands reached through the doorway, but I slammed it shut, the sound of their desperate fingers scraping against the wood echoing in my ears. I didn't stop running. I didn't dare look back. By the time I reached the break room, I was covered in black goo, my clothes sticky and soaked. My hands were shaking so violently that I could hardly unlock the door. When I finally stumbled inside, I collapsed against the wall, gasping for air, trying to make sense of what had just happened. And that's when I saw him. Mr. Rook. He was standing in the corner, his face covered in the same black tar. It dripped down his face, pooling around his feet like it had been there for hours. His expression remained the same, calm, almost detached, but I could see the twitching at the corners of his lips. A subtle, unsettling movement. I tried to speak, but my voice was lost in my throat. The fear had choked it out. Mr. Rook didn't move. His eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment I realized he wasn't just watching me, he was waiting. I don't know how long I've been here anymore. Time doesn't feel the same at the park. The clocks don't tick in a way that makes sense. The shadows stretch in unnatural ways, and the stillness never feels truly still. Something has shifted. Maybe it's me. Maybe it's the park. But I can feel it, creeping through my bones, settling into my chest, suffocating me with every breath I take. The terror is constant now. The paranoia has taken hold in ways I didn't know were possible. I can't trust my eyes. I can't trust my ears. I think I'm going insane. The animatronics were supposed to be stationary, right? They're just machines. I've seen them before, frozen, lifeless, just hulking figures standing in the dark corners of the park, their faces locked in wide, painted smiles. But tonight they're different. I noticed it first with the clown. It was standing by the Ferris wheel, just like it always did. I'd walked past it 100 times, never giving it more than a glance. But tonight, its eyes followed me. No, not just followed me, it watched me. I tried to shake it off, to keep moving, to get to the break room, and lock myself away from whatever was happening. But the moment I looked away, I heard the low hum, the sound of gears turning. And when I glanced back, it wasn't standing anymore. The clown was moving. Its mechanical joints groaned as it took a step toward me, its painted smile stretching wider, impossibly wide, as if it were eager to greet me. Its eyes were not just watching anymore, they were alive. They followed me, blinked, and moved with an intelligence that shouldn't have been there. My pulse thudded in my ears and I took a step back, not trusting my legs to hold me up. I could feel the weight of its stare, feel the dread that flooded my chest, crawling up my throat. Then it spoke. Hazel. The voice was distorted, garbled, as if it were coming from deep within the machinery, but there was no mistaking it. It said my name. Hazel. Hazel. It repeated, dragging each syllable like it was savoring the sound of it. I stumbled backward, but the moment I turned, I saw them. The animatronics, every single one of them, was moving. The bear, the rabbit, the fox, the clown. They were all alive now, their grotesque faces twisted into deranged smiles that shouldn't have been able to form on their metal, welded bodies. Their eyes blinked, and their mouths moved, distorting into mocking expressions of joy and malice. They began to speak. Hazel. 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 Each one called my name, their voices blending into a distorted chorus that reverberated through my skull, crawling inside my mind like worms. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My legs felt like jelly. I could hardly breathe. The park seemed to stretch and distort around me. I looked toward the carousel, and what I saw almost made me lose my mind entirely. The carousel had started spinning, not slowly, not in a controlled motion. It was spinning out of control, faster and faster, the wooden horses jerking in midair, their mechanical heads snapping from side to side like they were alive. The music, the same old tune that had once been cheerful, was now a discordant, broken mess, a shrieking melody that scraped at my sanity. And then, I heard it, the laughter of children. It was distant at first, barely a whisper, but then it grew louder, closer. Laughter, dozens of children laughing, but it wasn't real. The sound was hollow, faint. It was as if it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The laughter followed me, filling my ears, drowning out everything else. I had to get out. I had to leave. I turned and ran. But I could hear them. The animatronics, their footsteps, their voices. They were behind me, closing in, following my every move. The park itself felt alive, bending and twisting with each step I took, as though the ground beneath me was changing its shape. I barely made it to the break room. I slammed the door shut behind me, my heart racing. I tried to steady myself, to find some semblance of control. But the moment I saw Mr. Rook standing in the corner, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. He was just standing there as always, silent and still. But this time, something was wrong. His face was covered in the same black tar I had seen earlier, dripping down from his eyes, his mouth, his ears, pooling around his feet like the remnants of a dark, forgotten ritual. His eyes weren't the same anymore. They were empty, hollow, like the tar had consumed him, had swallowed the very soul from his body. I felt a cold dread in my stomach. You saw them, didn't you? His voice was slow, measured, as if nothing had changed, as if this was all part of the plan. I couldn't speak. I could hardly move. I had so many questions, so many things I needed to understand. But all I could do was stand there, my legs shaking under me. Mr. Rook smiled. It wasn't a comforting smile. It wasn't even a smile at all. It was the smile of someone who knew far more than they were willing to share. "The park chose you," he said, his voice dripping with something that was both too calm and too eager. "It needed someone just like you." I felt my chest tighten. What did he mean by that? He took a step closer, and I could feel the air in the room grow colder, heavier, as though the shadows were pressing in from all sides. "The park is alive, Hazel," he said, his voice low and almost conspiratorial. "It feeds off fear. It thrives on torment. The animatronics, the dolls, the toys, they're all part of the cycle. They're waiting for someone to break the rules, for someone to give in. They feed on it, and they'll keep coming, over and over. As long as someone obeys the rules, someone like you." I recoiled. My head spun. I tried to make sense of his words, but they didn't fit together. It was too much. And then, with a sickening clarity, it hit me. Mr. Rook wasn't a man. He wasn't human. He was part of the park. A mechanism. A puppet. Created to enforce the rules, to make sure the cycle kept spinning. He was the park's keeper, its enforcer, its mouthpiece. And now, it had chosen me. The thought settled into my gut like a heavy stone. The truth had never been clearer, nor more horrifying. It's strange how the truth can come at you like a hammer, all at once, and yet, it feels like it's been creeping in from the corners of your mind, inch by inch, until you can no longer deny it. I thought I was alive. I knew I was alive. Or at least, that's what I had told myself. Even after everything, the animatronics, the dolls, Mr. Rook, the strange rules and the twisted nightmares that kept breaking through, I believed, deep down, that I was still living. That I was just trying to survive, to get out, to keep my sanity intact. But now, as I stood there facing Mr. Rook in the park, everything clicked. The sick, horrible truth, the one I had been avoiding, slamming into my mind with the force of 1,000 nightmares. I wasn't alive. I never had been. The first night, that was when it happened. I had been killed. The park killed me. I could feel it now, deep in my chest. There was no heartbeat, no pulse, no breath. The hollow emptiness in my chest, the heavy weight in my limbs, everything about me screamed dead. But I couldn't remember it. I couldn't remember dying. The park had taken that from me too. I was just another soul trapped in this nightmare, forced to live, forced to repeat, the same cycle over and over again. Cleaning, maintaining, following the rules, obeying every command like a puppet on strings. I looked down at my hands, at the faded, brittle skin stretched too tight across the bones, cracked and decayed. It wasn't just the tar that coated me now. It was death, the rot that had set into my body the moment the park took me. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was the park itself. I felt it now, the pulse of it, the hum beneath my feet, the subtle breathing of the walls around me. The park wasn't just a place. It wasn't just some abandoned carnival ground, haunted by broken machines. It was alive. Alive in a way I had never understood. A living, breathing, sentient being that fed on souls, trapping them in a grotesque cycle of torment, forcing them to relive their pain forever. It had been feeding on me. The animatronics, the dolls, the grotesque laughter, they were all part of it, extensions of the park's will. The park's hunger. They were the keepers of its twisted game, forcing me to follow the rules, to clean, to keep the park's horrific cycle turning. Every night, every task, every moment had been carefully crafted to break me down, to wear away at my mind and spirit until I became nothing more than a part of the machinery. I looked at Mr. Rook, his lifeless eyes staring back at me, that smile never leaving his face. I knew now. I knew what he was, what he had always been. He wasn't human. He was a puppet. A vessel for the park's will, sent to ensure that the game played on. The rules weren't just some arbitrary set of guidelines. They were chains. Boundaries to keep us trapped in the cycle. Obey the rules, or else. The punishment wasn't death. No, it was something worse. It was this. I felt the ground beneath me shift, the walls closing in like they had a mind of their own. The carousel started up again, its discordant music cutting through the air like jagged glass. The laughter of children echoed once more, louder now, filling every corner of the park with a mocking, hollow sound. And then I saw it. A new janitor. A man, young, fresh-faced, unaware. He stood at the entrance of the park, looking around with wide eyes, taking in the broken, decaying rides, the rusting machines. He looked so much like I had when I first walked in. Naive, hopeful, desperate for work. He had no idea what he was walking into. But I did. I knew exactly what was about to happen. The cycle was about to begin again. And I knew, with a sick certainty, that there was nothing I could do to stop it. I screamed. My voice cracked, but the sound was swallowed by the park, by the oppressive silence that followed. The fear that had been building inside me, the knowledge that I was just another victim in this horrific game, erupted into a final, desperate cry. But before I could make another sound, the lights flickered. The music swelled, and everything went silent. The park had won. It had claimed me, just as it had claimed so many before me. My final scream was cut off, replaced by the eerie melody of the carousel, playing on as the park's lights flickered one last time, bathing everything in a sickly glow. The cycle had begun again, and I was just another part of the game.